Thank you, Mr. Chairman. President Obama's recess appointments on January 4th, 2012 to the National Labor Relations Board and to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau are different in kind than previous recess appointments that have been made by presidents from both political parties, including the 179 recess appointments referred to by my distinguished colleague, the senior senator from California. These appointments, that is, those that occurred on January 4th of this year, are unconstitutional because they did not, as required by Article 2, Section 2, receive the advice and consent of the Senate, and they didn't follow the form that has historically been required, quite appropriately under the text of the Constitution, for recess appointments. Now, President Obama, of course, insists that these appointments were justified under the Recess Appointments Clause. That clause provides that the President may, quote, fill up all vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate, close quote. That clause simply doesn't apply, whereas here the Senate was not in recess at the time the appointments were made. In making these particular appointments, the President did not state that he believes an intra-session adjournment of less than 3 days constitutes a recess, and there can be little dispute that such a brief adjournment as occurred between January 3rd, 2012, when the second session of the 112th Congress began, and January 6th, 2012, when the next pro forma session of that Congress was held, does not in fact constitute a recess for purposes of the Recess Appointments Clause. Now, the Department of Justice has consistently maintained that an intra-session adjournment must be longer than 3 days to constitute such a recess, the kind of recess that can trigger the recess appointment power. And the text of the Constitution evidences that the framers did not consider an adjournment of less than 3 days to be constitutionally significant. Indeed, Article 1, Section 5 provides that, quote, neither House during the session of Congress shall, without the consent of the other, adjourn for more than 3 days, close quote. At the time of these appointments, these appointments were made, the Senate had not received consent from the House of Representatives to adjourn for more than 3 days, and that's constitutionally significant here. If an intra-session adjournment of less than 3 days were to be considered constitutionally sufficient for the President to exercise this recess appointment power, it's unclear what, if anything, might prevent the President from routinely bypassing the Constitution's advice and consent requirement and appointing nominees during weekend adjournments. The Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel asserts that the President may unilaterally conclude that the Senate's brief pro forma sessions do not constitute sessions of the Senate for purposes of the recess appointment power. But this assertion is deeply flawed. It's really for the Senate and not for the President of the United States to determine when the Senate is in session. We are, after all, a coordinate branch of government. And the Constitution expressly grants the Senate the power to determine the rules of its own proceedings, not to the President. Granting the President the unilateral power to override the Senate's determination as to when it's in session or when it's in recess would undermine the constitutional prerogative, and it would violate the Constitution's fundamental principles of separation of powers. The OLC memorandum asserts that the touchstone for determining when the Senate is in session is, quote, its practical effect, viz. Whether or not the Senate is capable of exercising its constitutional function of advising and consenting to executive nominations, close quote. Now, this analysis contradicts both the text and the original understanding of the Recess Appointments Clause. The purpose of that clause was to avoid obliging the Senate, in the words of Alexander Hamilton from Federalist Number 67, to be continually in session for the appointment of officers. Nothing in either the Constitution's text or in the debates surrounding the Recess Appointments Clause in any way suggests that the President should have unilateral power to appoint officers and judges at times when the Senate is regularly meeting, even if that body is not conducting substantial business. In addition, the OLC memorandum's functionalist argument fails on its own terms. During the Senate's pro forma sessions, including its session on January 6, 2012, the Senate was manifestly capable of exercising its constitutional function of advice and consent. Notably, at one such pro forma session just in the last few weeks, on December 23, 2011, the Senate passed a significant piece of legislation demonstrating that it is capable of conducting business at such sessions, and in that instance, it did. Regardless of how much business the Senate conducts during pro forma sessions, or how much business it indicates in statements that it intends in advance to conduct at such sessions, the Senate has been and continues to be capable of conducting business at such sessions, including advising and consenting to nominations should it decide to do so. It's not just capable of it, it has in fact done it. And so OLC's argument really boils down to the untenable position that because the Senate has chosen not to act on the President's nominations during its sessions, it was incapable of doing so. And that conclusion just can't follow, not from the facts, not from the logic of its own analysis. Finally, OLC's assertion that pro forma sessions are not cognizable for purposes of the recess appointment power violates established constitutional practice and tradition. The Constitution provides that neither House during the session of Congress shall, without the consent of the other, adjourn for more than 3 days. And unless Congress shall by law appoint a different day, Congress shall begin each annual session by meeting at noon on the 3rd day of January. Now, the Senate has commonly, and to my knowledge without any objection, used pro forma sessions to fulfill both of those constitutional requirements. This evidences a past consensus that such sessions really are of constitutional significance. President Obama's novel assertion that such sessions no longer count for purposes of the recess appointment power thus upsets precedent, and it creates an internal contradiction in the treatment of the session for purposes of the Constitution in this area. President Obama's January 4, 2012 appointments to the CFPB and the NLRB are therefore unconstitutional. As duly sworn United States Senators, we each have an institutional and a constitutional duty to preserve and defend the prerogatives of the Senate, particularly from the encroachments of the executive. The President's unconstitutional appointments simply cannot stand. Throughout my time on this committee, I've made it a point to work collaboratively with members across the aisle. I've also gone out of my way to cooperate with the current administration to ensure that the overwhelming majority of the President's nominees are considered and receive a vote. And I have voted for dozens of nominees with whom I fundamentally disagree on various issues. But I will do so no more. I want to be clear that my concerns today are nonpartisan in nature. And they do now, and they will in the future be equally critical of any Republican president who might attempt to make recess appointments under the same flawed legal theory that this president has adopted through this OLC memorandum. So given this president's blatant and egregious disregard for both constitutional procedures and for the Senate's unquestioned role in such appointments, I find myself duty-bound to resist the consideration and approval of additional nominations until the President takes steps to remedy the situation. Regardless of precisely what course I choose to take, the President will not continue to enjoy the same nearly complete cooperation unless or until he rescinds his unconstitutional recess appointments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.